Hello, it's wonderful to be here with you, Sue, on this program. It's just great to see you across the ocean.
Thank you. Yeah, it's good to see you too. And it does feel like we're in the same room. It doesn't feel like we have a distance. And it's great to be able to have this conversation about the power of poetry. I'm really looking forward to hearing what you've got to say, Hiram.
And in the spirit of making sure that we set the appropriate tone here, I would just love to hear you read an opening poem, Sue, to get us going.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I've chosen a poem from my last collection, which is called Confetti Dancers. And I chose this poem because of this discussion about the power of poetry. The poem's called Bryce. It's about a friend of mine who died in 1987 from AIDS-related complications. I worked in the Royal Academy of Dancing in the 1980s, and I saw the dance world being decimated by AIDS. And unfortunately, Bryce was one of the victims of this pandemic. He was a choreologist, he notated dances. And I suppose the AIDS crisis has been to the front of my mind because of the recent COVID pandemic. And I still think that the AIDS crisis doesn't get the discussion and recognition it deserves. So I'm going to read this poem called Bryce. In it, I mention a quilt, and it's a reference to the Names Project, which started in San Francisco. And they were making a quilt square for every AIDS victim. And it was very early days. It was in a tiny office in Market Street in San Francisco. And I signed Bryce's name. He was very newly deceased when I went there, into one of the squares. And now it fills a warehouse, which feels really tragic. So I'll read this poem. Bryce. I learn this quilt will contain 100,000 unknown names. All 42 of my facial muscles try not to cry as I stitch the memory of the day you showed me your arms bejeweled with sarcoma. How I felt the stutter of your dancing heartbeat. I reimagine you flying home to die in the Australian sun, while we mourned among the cold grey bricks of Rotherhithe. Then the others too were claimed, one by one, long and slow and cruel as purgatory. I honour your name in thread the colour of sunlight, whispering all the news of all the years you never knew me.
Sue, Sue, Sue. That last couplet, whispering all the news of all the years you never knew me, that the hollow, haunting sound in those last two lines are indicative of just the kind of poetry that I think we are hoping to visit about today. Powerful, powerful poetry that, in the case of your poem, responds to the tragedy of the AIDS pandemic, and as you say, echoes so clearly in today's frame of the COVID pandemic. So thank you for sharing that amazing poem. Bryce would have been very proud of it, I am sure.
Oh, thank
Honored by
you.
it.
Thank you. That's a lovely thing to say.
I'm Hiram Larew from Maryland, USA, just outside of Washington, D.C., and it is my grinning pleasure to share this time with Sue Burge, who is, as everyone knows, a poetry force in the UK and beyond. And it's also just a delight to work with the Homestage team of Tom Harrison, Amelia Ireson, Ashley Garford, and Mark Fawcett to showcase the power of poetry in this installment of Meet the Poets. So, over the next few minutes, Sue and I will be showcasing the many ways that poetry can help respond to a variety of social needs. Now more than ever, we really need the solace and power of poetry to respond to what many call a world of need. So to get things going, let's turn to Sue so that she can describe the important work she is doing with senior poets.
Thanks, Hiram. It's a lovely introduction. I think most of the workshops and classes I run are attended by writers in their 60s, 70s, and 80s. And I just find them fascinating to work with because they bring such a breadth of life experience to the sessions. Of course, the younger poets I work with, they have the same concerns in their work. But I think for more mature poets, themes like loss and grief, maybe unresolved childhood trauma, and especially ideas around death and the aging process, they're more to the fore as you get older, for sure. So I find that I personally process the world through writing poetry and reading poetry. It's my way of unpicking problems, coming to terms with anything that's troubling me. And maybe that's largely because you can make yourself pretty vulnerable in poetry and take risks. And I think you can do that because you can take a step back from what you're writing through the power of words. For example, you can change pronouns. I don't need to use I, the first person. I can couch my vulnerability in you, or he, or she, or we, or I can adopt a persona. So a poet I often use as an example is Catherine Beavis. She's dealing with a terminal cancer prognosis, and in her book Flamingo, she's got a poem called "My Body Tells Me She Is Filing for a Divorce." So she's got a great deal of empathy with this she persona she's created for her own body. And she's able to address issues she might not have been able to do through the first person pronoun. And she's also got this amazing poem called "My Cancer as a Ring-Tailed Lemur." And in the first lines, she says, "We both know one day she'll eat me, but for now we dance, a little game of catch me if you can. Tracking her is difficult." And I think one of poetry's superpowers is to give us a way to navigate our lives and to understand ourselves better. Poetry seems to directly tap into our subconscious and draw us out in a way that it can become quite transcendent. So being able to transmit that to my students and to let them have that catharsis of dealing with the issues in their lives, that's really important to me. And they produce the most amazing, moving work.
Well, your students must be very, very lucky to have you as an instructor, Sue.
Thank you. Yeah, I love it. I really enjoy it. And Hiram, you're a poet who, you address such key issues in your work and projects. And I was thinking about the way you interact with the issue of hunger. I'm so shocked that societies such as yours in the US and mine in the UK were still dealing with issues of hunger poverty.
Yes.
And the shame around that is devastating. We always think hunger's a problem for other countries, countries with poorer economies, but it's here. So I wondered if we could turn to you now and hear a bit more about Poetry X Hunger and how you feel that poetry's got the power to raise awareness around this issue.
You're absolutely right. We sometimes think that hunger is over there or has disappeared. It hasn't. It's everywhere. It's almost next door. It's certainly on the nearest street corner. So I started what's called Poetry X Hunger, an initiative. I started that about 5 years ago as a way to try to bring a world of poets and their poetry to the anti-hunger cause. And at the time I started the initiative, there really weren't many poems about what I call empty stomach hunger. There weren't many on offer. So now, fast forward, and in partnership with many, many groups, like the United Nations, End Hunger UK, and lots of others, we've posted about 400 poems by poets from near and far on the Poetry X Hunger website. And here's a kind of a key point. Beyond just posting the poems on the website, putting them up on the shelf, we've pulled them down. Those poems are being used to raise awareness about hunger in classrooms, in houses of worship, in policy discussions, and the like. And we've also recently started to use the poetry to raise significant financial support for school gardens in Uganda, for food banks in the US, and for the international work that the group called Feed the Children does. So the bottom line is, if anyone ever doubted the power of hunger-focused poetry to reach hearts, I'd like to demonstrate how those doubters can be convinced. Here's a 2.5-minute recorded poem that I believe will erase all doubts. It was written and read by the US-based poet Brian Donald James. The poem Testimony was recognized by the United Nations as a winning one, and I think you'll see why.
Hello, my name is Brian Donald James, and I would like to share my 2020 United Nations and Poetry X Hunger award-winning poem, Testimony. Testimony. I was a teenage father then, with little money. My wife and I saved our lunch so that our son could eat. And we went without a meal that day. As night approached, we had hoped that he would sleep until morning. And with every twist and turn that he made, my anxiety rose and fell. But as toddlers do, he rose hungry, rubbing circles on his belly. He was trying to be a big boy, trying to control the desperation that I saw in his eyes. I nodded to my wife, and we gathered change from everywhere, anywhere, between cushions and under couches, closets, desk, and cabinet drawers, and I was off to shop with newly found pocket change. Enough for some instant noodles, Kool-Aid, bread, and peanut butter. Even as I counted out the change and people in line smirked and commented, the cashier and I knew I didn't have enough. My eyes swelled as I tried to control my desperation. But she smiled and said, "Well, honey, that's just enough." Bagged my food and I left. Walking back to our little apartment, I will never forget that feeling. Emotion overcame me, not embarrassment or shame, just thankfulness, just love. I'll do anything for my boy. In peace. Thank you so much.
So that's a little bit about Poetry X Hunger. So now let's turn back to Sue to discuss her work with the power of poetry to heal, to engage with the environment, and to explore the joys and the challenges of aging. And just a little bit more about Sue, her collection in progress, Watch It Slowly Fade, is forthcoming in 2024 from Hedgehog Poetry Press. Sue?
Thanks, Hiram. And yeah, I just wanted to say what a stunning poem that was. It's so moving, especially towards the end. You just feel feel so devastated by the situation that's being described in that hunger poem. So yeah, that is such great work. Thank you so much for initiating that. So moving on to another huge issue, which is climate crisis. I live in North Norfolk in the UK. I'm 7 minutes walk from the sea. And my big fear is that 7-minute walk is going to become a 5-minute walk, because coastal erosion is huge in this area of the world. I can really see it. I have evidence that things are going badly wrong more quickly than we thought. So there are lots of cliff falls. Towns and villages along this coastline are experiencing land loss. People are losing their houses. So in Watch It Slowly Fade, I suppose what I'm trying to do is bring different landscapes to life. And at the heart of each poem, because for me it's really important not to preach. You don't get anywhere by preaching, as that poem that we've just heard shows. But at the heart of each one, there's a little bit of climate angst. So it's the soul of each poem is this kind of climate angst ongoing. I'm really influenced by the American poet Natalie Diaz for this collection. She grew up on a Mojave reservation, and she voices the concerns of the indigenous peoples of the US. And I just wanted to quote a bit from her poem, The First Water is the Body. And she says, "The Colorado River is the most endangered river in the United States. Also, it is a part of my body. I carry a river. It is who I am. Aha Makav. This is not a metaphor." When a Mojave says, "Inyek aha makavach ichum," we are saying our name. We are telling a story of our existence. The river runs through the middle of my body. So far, I have said the word river in every stanza. I don't want to waste water. I must preserve the river in my body. And I found that so profound. I suppose I'm troubled that I can't speak for the landscape. It's not my right. It's not within my scope of knowledge. But it is my right to voice concern, and about the climate crisis and my place within it. We don't owe the planet. We're part of it. We're these strange beings made up of 60% water. Diaz is so right. We are part of this. We're part of the landscape. We're not on the landscape. So occasionally I try and give the elements and the landscape a voice or a persona. And in my poem, Water is Thinking, the final lines are, "Water scrawls messages on the sand, hopes they will soon be understood. Water thinks, there's so much of me, and oh, they are so small." So I do occasionally presume to take on the voice of one of the elements.
Yes.
So that's what I'm hoping to achieve in this.
There's such a long history of nature poetry for as long as poetry has been written. But I think what you and your work and work of many, many others these days is pointing out is an update, refresh of some of that poetry, particularly as so much of that nature is threatened, and raising the voices of concern through poetry, as you've just described and shown us, I think is very much a key tool in our work to try to save and salvage the world around us.
Absolutely. And I'm hoping to get over the idea that it's not self and other. It's not us and the planet. It's all one. But Hiram, I want to turn back to you at this point, because we know that almost all of the planet's ills are as a result of our abuse and our lack of care. And I think as well this manifests not just towards nature, but towards our fellow beings throughout history. So I think we bear a collective shame for the legacy of colonialism and how colonial power abused land and people. And I know you've been part of this incredible project, which is concerned with slavery's tragic legacy. And I read this quote recently by Louise Gluck, the great poet who died recently. and I think this will really resonate with you, about the power of poetry. She says, poetry survives because it haunts, and it haunts because it is simultaneously utterly clear and deeply mysterious, because it cannot be entirely accounted for, it cannot be exhausted. And I thought that was really important for our conversation.
Yes.
Another writer I know, Joanne Penn Cooper, she wrote recently, I've been thinking about how writers like Toni Morrison and Adrienne Rich constantly sought to estrange the familiar versions of history and ongoing injustice to help us see it anew. Writing is so many things: witness, renewal, seeing anew, call and response, a call to awaken, to connect. Only connect, as Forster wrote. And I thought that really connects with your Amazing Voices of Woodlawn project. So I wondered if you could tell us a little bit about that.
Sure. I think you're absolutely right that those quotes from those poets, absolutely true. As far as I'm concerned, the power of poetry to haunt through its mystery, but also through its keen, keen eye and sense of observation, I think is a key to the difference poetry can make. About 4 years ago, just before the pandemic, I was offered a writer residency at an historic plantation outside of Washington, D.C., that was built by relatives of George Washington on property that he owned. And in its day, the estate, it's called Woodlawn Plantation, was lived in by 9 whites who were served by 90 slaves. The lives of those slaves, their lives, of the lives of those slaves, are largely unknown. So while at Woodlawn, writing away, I decided I really had to invite 3 friends, African American poets, to join me for a day. And then we assembled the resulting poems and artwork and music that resulted from their day's visit into a performance called Voices of Woodlawn, in which we try to describe that tragic history, largely unknown history of slavery. And of course, we wanted to consider what the legacy of that tragic history of slavery means to us today. It lives with us today. We've performed Voices of Woodlawn, the program, then widely, in person and these days via Zoom. And so here's a clip from that program. In it, you'll see poet Patrick Washington, one of the Voices of Woodlawn, presenting his poem written after he took the tour of Woodlawn Plantation. The poem is titled First Walk. Here's Patrick.
I'm not being led through these genteel halls. I'm being pushed. Each threshold I cross feels like praise is being forced through tearful, fearful throats. The words of our guide ease out with reverence as if the echo of these walls could actually slap you. And as they deliver their careful sermon, I can't help but wonder, was God ever inside here? The wood smells of elegant care and surfaces so polished that any particles daring to show up would undoubtedly slide off to the floor. After all, we are not here to see dirt, are we? Like a troublesome teen, I stand in places longer than I should, reach for delicate things I know I shouldn't, and nothing happens to me. This tour, though informative, ignored certain queries like, are the brick and mortar walls thick enough to muffle the moans of the people outside? Did they ever use the same cross-stitch sewing style from these beautiful pillows to close the skin of the disobedient? I walk out the ravenous front entrance, and after 200 years, the Corinthian marble at the door still looks as if each slab had been carefully laid there by angelic hands. One more question, ma'am. Did the masters of Woodlawn ever realize just how close they were to God?
So that's one of the several poems that are included, I should say, I think powerful poems, that are included in the Voices of Woodlawn program, in which poetry, music, and artwork are blended to work and present the tragedy of slavery and what it means to us today.
Oh, thank you so much for sharing that, Hiram. Yeah, another really profoundly moving poem. And yes, what a response to that guided tour. What a deep response. And what an amazing project to be able to bring to life those forgotten voices in that way. It's been just amazing hearing about your projects.
Well, ditto, mutually.
Yeah. Well,
Yours.
you're a real force for good. What you're doing is absolutely incredible, and you are doing a fantastic job of raising awareness. And I think you're going to carry on doing that fantastic job in the poem that you're going to read. So over to you to read one of your amazing poems.
Sure. Yes, this poem does, in fact, echo back to the work that I've been involved with on the hunger front. I'm going to share it. It was written when I was a took a writer residency at an amazing place called the Heinrich Boll Writers' Cottage on Achill Island in County Mayo, Ireland. And the poem first appeared in a journal called The New Ulster, and then in my 2021 collection, Mud, a Jar. There are just a couple of things to mention about the poem. The potato blight famine occurred in Ireland from 1845 to 1849. And to reach Achill Island from mainland Ireland, you have to cross Achill Sound. The poem is titled Achill Sound. When the roads curve like sound and dip, as if lifting to bow, whenever all thoughts round or cluster, or when hearts call down, is Ireland. And as rich when poor was, or as wise as bare heads in snow seemed, and as twigs so frail broke into song, and as true as any blight or potato could be, was Ireland. So, when sand laps the senses, or salt drips the edges as dreams, whenever hope streams through such heavens, and moss comes home, or hearts beam down, is Ireland. So that's my love song, love poem to Ireland. Sue, it has just been a delight to hear about your work, to share Homestage with you, and to enjoy this time together on mic and camera with you.
Yeah, I absolutely second that, and thank you for that beautiful, what a chilling subject, but what a beautiful poem. And being moved does raise your awareness as well, because you want to go further into finding out about that. So thank you so much for sharing that. And
thanks to the Homestage team again, Tom and Amelia and Ashley and Mark, for all the work that they've done to make this possible for us today.
Yeah, absolutely. I've really enjoyed it. It's been wonderful to hear your words, Hiram. You're so wise, and I've learnt a lot from you.
It's mutual.
Thank you.
So from across the pond, I'm wishing everyone well. And Sue, I just hope that we can continue to work together. I learned so much from you and your work, and look forward to ongoing collaboration.
Yes, please. That would be great. Okay.
Take care.
You too.